The recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award for the Department of Theater and Drama, Professor Deborah Dryden. Professor Dryden is a renowned costume designer who has worked with prestigious theaters across the United States. Exhibitions of her designs have also appeared at the Prague Quadrennial, the Bagratión Museum in Moscow, and the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. She designed costumes for the Broadway premiere of Robert Schenkken's All the Way, and is the resident costume designer emerita for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where she was designing for 4 decades. Professor Dryden is also the author of Fabric Painting and Dyeing for the Theater, and continues to innovate in surface design. Her numerous accolades include the Michael Merritt Award and the Irene Sheriff Lifetime Achievement Award. Additionally, she is a professor emerita of design at the University of California, San Diego, where she taught for 17 years. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Dryden.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here, and it's a really hard act to follow these last 3 people, I have to say. And unfortunately, although some of you have been so wonderful with your extemporaneous speaking, I'm going to breed mine, so I'll try to be as interesting as I can, given the circumstances. First of all, I want to thank Dean Haddix, the School of Education, Professor Shanahan and the Department of Theater, and all those who made this event possible. I've been asked to share with you how the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Department of Theater and Drama, and the School of Education shaped my life and career. Perhaps the easiest way to start is to say that I literally grew up in the Department of Theater here in Madison. My father, Professor Ronald Mitchell, joined the department in 1939 and was the director of theater here for 25 years. He used to say that for his interview here in 1938, there was a big hole in the ground where the Wisconsin Union Theater was just about to be built. Upon his retirement many decades later, he was given the great honor of having the Mitchell Theater named for him. Growing up with a director-professor father introduced me to theater at a very young age. We had our regular seats at the Wisconsin Union Theater. I think I could actually find them again, where one of my earliest memories is seeing a production of Annie Get Your Gun, in which there was a live palomino on stage. You can imagine the impression that made on me as a young girl. The Wisconsin Players, as they were called then, had an office right at the end of the hall, just past the play circle. In that office was a storage closet where boxes of paper, mimeograph machines, if anybody remembers what those were, and files were kept. But also, in that storage closet was a small hole in the wall with a plug, which allowed one to view the entire stage of the Wisconsin Union Theater. Legend had it that artistic director at the time, Fred Berkey, had put it there so he could keep an eye on productions on stage. Regardless how it got there, it was a wonderful treat as a little girl to be lifted up to see what was on stage through this mysterious eyepiece. My association and influence of the Department of Theater continued on through my high school days at Wisconsin High School, which at that time was a teaching wing of the university. Those of us lonely high school teenagers who gravitated to theater had the great good fortune to be taught by enthusiastic graduate students from the university. We were thereby introduced to the works of Sean O'Casey, Heinrich Ibsen, Anton Chekhov, and of course, William Shakespeare. In the final year of my high school, a young professor named John Ezell, a recent UW Theater Department hire from Yale, came to talk to my high school class about what it was like to be a costume designer. He showed his designs for a production of Ben Jonson's Volpone that day, and his sketches are still visible to me in my mind this many years later. That meeting was the spark that lit the flame of my career path. I realized that theater design, and specifically costume design, could combine my varied interests in art, fashion, history, theater, and literature. That galvanizing moment for me in high school turned into a career path that has served me for decades in the professional and academic theater. I studied with Professor Rizal throughout my undergraduate and graduate years at the UW. I'm also indebted to the many department faculty, especially Professors Gilbert Hemsley and Professor Marna King. Upon completing my graduate degree, I became a member of the newly created Department of Theater at the University of California at San Diego, which at that time was, as a university, as a wing of the University of California, only about 10 years old. There I helped to inaugurate the first undergraduate theater program in design and subsequently created their first graduate program in costume design. I'm happy to say that the UCSD costume design program continues to flourish under the leadership of Professor Judith Dolan. Simultaneous to my teaching career, I embarked on a professional design career that took me to major regional theaters in Chicago, San Francisco, Minneapolis, Atlanta, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. I had the rare opportunity to be able to combine my quote-unquote traveling design life with the stability of an artistic home at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. There, after retiring from academia, I became the resident costume designer. The Oregon Shakespeare Festival, celebrating its 90th season this coming year, is one of the few remaining professional rotating repertory theaters in the country. It's comprised of 3 theaters, producing both classic and contemporary work over a 9-month season, performing several plays in daily rotation 6 days a week. I was fortunate to work with that company for over 30 years before my retirement in 2019. I will get to some pictures pretty soon here. The art of costume design for the theater is really all about how to help tell a story through the use of fabric, color, and clothing. The stories we strive to tell are the narrative of the play itself, and as a costume designer, one is also tasked with assisting to tell the story of each character through their clothing. The way we tell these stories are as varied as the plays and the characters themselves. Sometimes it's required that the costume designer suggest a historical or a contemporary time period. Other times, the visual framing of the story provokes more fantastical imagery. While pursuing my graduate studies here at the university, I became interested in how to treat fabric through the use of dyeing, painting, and manipulation to create fabric that was more interesting than its original form. My incentive at that time was purely practical. Our student budget for productions were abysmally small. I'm curious if they still are. And so those of us with aspirations to create finer fabrics were challenged to make quote-unquote silk purses out of sow's ears. In my case, it led to many trials and errors in the dyeing and painting of fabric, which ultimately led to a lifelong obsession. I soon found that there were not many avenues to research textiles for the specific needs of the theater. This was before the internet, which is hard to believe, nor Instagram, nor YouTube, before even much had actually been written about fabric painting and dyeing for the theater specifically. And so I took it upon myself to attempt to write a book on the subject. Went backwards. A book on the subject. It took many years, much research, and 2 editions to complete. But in the end, I've been very grateful that the book seems to have helped many others who were struggling to find a manual to assist in their theater work. My own explorations in surface treatments of fabric have helped me many times in the telling of stories. For example, how to indicate the illusion of a huge, angry mob or group of citizens in Shakespeare's Coriolanus with only a handful of actors. Inspired by graffiti art, and specifically the work of street artist W.K. Interact, we decided to use anonymous images of faces screen printed onto very real street clothing. Obviously, we weren't fooling anyone that there were more than 6 actors in the mob, but our intention was to symbolically represent the mob through clothing. Embrace the constraints. Rather than being frustrated and complaining about lack of time, money, help, etc., the constraints that exist on any creative endeavor are often the keys to the imagination. T.S. Eliot is quoted as saying, "When forced to work within a strict framework, the imagination is tasked to the utmost and will produce its richest ideas." In a production of Macbeth, another 6-person adaptation, The design challenge was how to fabricate armor that was totally flexible for movement, would have stage blood spattered on it profusely in every performance, and the armor would have to be washed every day and dry in only a few hours before the next performance, along with all the rest of the costumes. Our solution was to create individualized armor that harkened back to the intricacy of samurai armor. It was created by weaving a variety of plastics, metal, and vinyl fabrics, all of which had to be pre-tested for washability with the stage blood. Those pieces were sewn to a strong nylon base so that it would dry in a few hours between matinee and evening performance. Would the solutions be different if the constraint was different? Of course. In an undergraduate design class with Professor Ezel, he said something that has stuck with me ever since. It's a simple statement. He said, "Imagine it first, then figure out how to make it." That mantra has come to my aid over and over again throughout my career. One of my favorite quote-unquote creation stories is our work on a production of Shakespeare's The Tempest. As some of you know, the character of Prospero has what is described as a quote-unquote magic garment, which gives him supernatural powers. He creates a devastating storm and shipwreck for his enemies. He creates magical illusions. He summons spirits. He ensnares his foes. But at the conclusion of the play, he deliberately relinquishes his powers, removes his magic garment, breaks his staff, and returns to the world. Many conceptual meetings with the director and other designers included questions of how he might envision this garment. I proposed that perhaps it was invisible, but perhaps that was a bit too much like Harry Potter. How can it seem to go on and off effortlessly? How can it convey mystery and magic and symbology and yet still be something as simple as a robe, a cloak, a garment? I struggled with how best to imagine this I've purposely got it black, thanks. I'm leading up to it. I struggled with how best to imagine this fantastical and important garment. Then, serendipitously, while traveling, I found this image in, of all things, an airline magazine. It was an image of a 15th century talismanic shirt, one of many currently held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. I had never heard of talismanic shirts, but the more I researched them, the more I realized that this indeed could be the inspiration for Prospero's magic cloak. Talismanic shirts were designed to give the wearer special powers and to protect them from evil spirits. The use of calligraphy and symbols on the shirts invoked a great spiritual power. The words of Professor Ezel returned to me, imagine it first, then figure out how to create it. In this case, I had an amazing team of artisans with whom we collaboratively worked together to create this magic garment. Unlike talismanic shirts, we chose to depict a more universal variety of symbols and iconography, reflecting many different belief systems. The use of the hexagram and the pentad, for instance, are utilized in many different cultures' spiritual symbology. The large circular imagery that you see on the sleeves indicate Copernicus' 16th century heliocentric model of the universe. Mirrored on the reverse side is an image of a cross-section of a human DNA molecule. We created this garment out of sheer fabric dyed in multiple related hues of old parchment, ombreed in its final iteration in red dye. The use of sheer organza as the fabric allowed the images to interact with one another and imparted a fluidity and sense of impermanence in contrast to the strong physicality of the actor. Given our time constraints, I designed the garment to be able to be fabricated in pieces so that some sections could be stitched in the workroom while at the same time other pieces were being done and painted. In this matter, the method of fabrication was as critical to the design process as imagining the symbolism and the imagery of the garment itself. I've got a couple repeats in there, sorry about that. One of the features of working in regional theater is that it offers a place to support and develop new work in its earliest iterations. As Dean Haddix has mentioned, in 2013, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival produced Robert Schenken's epic All the Way and a secondary play called, not secondary in importance, but a sequel called The Great Society. Both are a dramatic investigation of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. The first play, All the Way, illuminates the drama of LBJ's political skill in manipulating Congress into passing the Civil Rights Act. The second play, The Great Society, takes the arc in a different direction, illustrating the collapse of his presidency with the tragedy of the Vietnam War. After a successful run at OSF, the plays were then produced at the Seattle Repertory Theater and the American Repertory Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts, before the commercial run of All the Way on Broadway in 2014 with Bryan Cranston playing Lyndon Johnson, Michael McKean as J. Edgar Hoover, some of you may recognize him from his film roles, and Brandon Durden as Martin Luther King. All the Way received the Tony Award for Best Play of that year, as did Mr. Cranston for Best Actor in a Play. Working on these two plays for what turned out to be 3 years, my job as a costume designer was to meld real, historically accurate images with the requirements of the stage. Many plays which take place in a time other than our own utilize historical research as inspiration. However, in the case of these two LBJ plays, this was a highly documented era with very recognizable principal characters, at least to those of us who had lived through that period of time. So it seemed important to us that while we might take liberties in other ways, the clothing should resonate as closely as possible to the historical context of the time. To that end, I was able to conduct extensive research at the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, where I was granted special access to their archives to see and document actual suits that President Johnson wore. I could view not only the suits, but accessories such as his famous cowboy boots, down to the ubiquitous Silver Star lapel pin, honoring his service in World War II. The archivist opened storage closets containing Lady Bird's dresses, including the cream-colored dress that you see in this famous picture of her standing behind her husband in Air Force One on that memorable day when he was being sworn in as president. I was also able to see a flat file treasure trove of the fashion designs created for Lady Bird by her primary designer, Molly Parnas. The archives were a goldmine of historical research for this project. For the menswear, we scoured our resources across the country for vintage 1960s men's suits, which, let me tell you, are very difficult to find in good stage-worthy condition and in appropriate sizes. We then augmented our acquired collection of vintage clothing with suits that were tailored for the production. The challenge, however, when you combine actual vintage clothing with quote-unquote built clothing, costumes, is to make all the clothing appear as if it's from the same era. Even with this type of historical recreation of clothing, there is conscious interpretation which helps distinguish individual characters from one another. In this case, the attention to detail and care in research were fundamental to supporting the narrative. Throughout my career, I've been grateful for the wide variety of work that has come my way. I've been able to design for the classics, especially the work of Shakespeare, in many different imaginings of time, space, and character. I've also designed for contemporary work and new plays in development. I've worked on large and small stages with both minimal and more generous budgets. I've had to create costumes in tiny costume shops with a handful of co-workers and larger workshops with significant support teams. Perhaps the best way to exemplify the variety of work that a costume designer might encounter in one's career is to share with you, just for 1 minute, a short slideshow of some of my favorite projects. I won't need to comment. Regardless of the circumstances, the requirements of the costumes design remain the same. Tell the story. Support the actors and director's vision. Respect and support your coworkers. Tell the story. The art of costumes design, like all theater arts, is not a solo endeavor. We rely on the talent and skills of our colleagues on the creative team to come together to share the story with our audience in the best way we can. Perhaps this is one of the things that drew me to costume design in the first place, the sense that the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. The seeds of my enchantment with the theater began here long ago, nourished by the support and teachings of my mentors, faculty, and fellow students, which allowed me to sustain a rich and varied career in the theater. I'm honored to be able to return home and to share a bit of my story with you all here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Shanahan. I'm the chair of the Department of Theater and Drama. Thank you, Professor Dryden, for sharing so much about your inspiring experience in costume design and in the world of theater and drama. And thank you for being with us here today and all the efforts you've made to further the Wisconsin idea and the reputation of our department in the world of theater and drama. We now have time for a few questions, so I'll open the floor to see who. We have questions for Deb, and thank you for coming up.
What was your most challenging project that you've worked on throughout your career?
They all have such different challenges. That's what makes the work so rich, because it's so varied. I shared with you the Prospero one. That was challenging for sure, because he wasn't the only person in the play. There are many other costumes to invent and create for that production. But that perhaps was one of the more challenging in terms of how to fabricate that particular garment in a way, given the time constraints that theater always represents. And so, as I said, the design included figuring out how to make that happen, in conjunction, of course, with other people involved, but it wasn't just simply a matter of doing the sketch, coming up with the idea, and carry on, everybody, you know. So I would say that was one of the more challenging ones, but they all are extremely challenging. Doing all the way, which seems like just a bunch of suits to some people, but it was really challenging. It was my first and only show on Broadway, and boy, that was a learning experience. And so that was a steep uphill climb for me, and also very rewarding, but that was challenging in a whole other sense. So.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation, and I appreciate your just the breadth of your work. I wondered, because the artistic piece of the renderings, but also making the renderings come to life, is there a particular aesthetic that you think informs your work, or is it mostly informed by just researching the context of the play, the time period, or do you think you see certain things and that's kind of how you imagine your work?
That's a great question. It is so much based on the play. The text of the play is really the heart and soul of where the aesthetic comes from, and then, I guess if I can call it that, where the soul of the piece comes from artistically, and then that being shaped and formed by the director's vision is the next piece of the shaping the sculpture. The other designers and, of course, the actors have huge part, not just in the performance, but in the creation of the idea. So I've said this, I think, in the interview earlier, that because of the collaborative nature of theater in general, I feel like for students it's a huge life skill, whether you go into theater or not. just to have participated in the process, as I say, it's a team sport. There is just no way you can just be a solo artist and do this kind of work, and you have to enjoy that. So I think I wandered away from your question, but
There was a question back there, yes.
How is it different creatively working in a repertory theater versus doing like one-off shows in other theaters?
oh, that's such a good question. The situation that I'm in, a repertory theater like Oregon Shakespeare Festival had a quasi or full resident company. A lot of that has changed throughout this country due to the decimation of the entertainment arts during COVID. And, many theaters have not been able to come back. The resident idea, though, is that at least a portion of your acting company it plays multiple roles and will be in many plays throughout the season, so that an audience can come and see this actor in this play, and they might see them in something else in the evening and another show a month down the road. For me, that was a huge gift, because whenever we talked a lot about relationships today, whenever you're engaging with somebody else, there's a kind of particularly with the designer-actor, there's a huge amount of trust required. An actor is putting their faith in you that you're not going to make them look stupid or ugly if that's not part of the character, or any number of things. There's a lot that goes on in those little small fitting rooms, and trust is required. And if you're just meeting somebody the first time, it's really hard to build that relationship in the short amount of time that you have. And so when you're working with a resident company of actors, you've built some of you've gotten over I call it the dance, where you're getting to know each other. You built some of that knowledge already, so you can cut to the chase and get on with what the character is about. Not who you are, who I am, do I trust you, are you going to be kind to me, or nice, or nasty, and so there's that. Also, the same thing is true with working with a trusted group of collaborators, like people who would be the people I work with in a costume shop, for instance. It's huge to work with the artists and artisans that you know and have worked with before, and you've already, again, built a language. You don't have to start from scratch. However, the other side of the coin is when I fly in to do a guest job, I'm introduced to a whole new ways of thinking, different groups of people, different visions, and so it keeps you on your toes, and you learn more. So I'm extremely grateful that I've had both experiences. Thanks for that question.
Any more questions? Yes.
The final one, the thing that I'm fascinated about, you did that, a lot of Shakespeare, and then you got to go to the LBJ library, and you referenced this a little bit of, there's all these iconic photos and the matching of the suits. Did you feel like that was a bigger problem solving? In other words, did you feel more free to play in the Shakespeare because those images are like, 500 years ago or whatever?
It's challenging.
60 years ago.
You're right.
And how did you do the suit matching for fabrics and all that? What kind of problem solving, and how many months did that take?
Well, it was a 3-year project, but not just, partly because the show went to several different theaters, not all with the same cast. So you're kind of reinventing the wheel. It's very challenging. I think any of you who are design or work in theater will attest to the fact when you're doing a historical, again, in this case, recognizable historical figures, I'm not going to put Martin Luther King in a plaid suit with a polka dot tie. There are iconic images that we either, even if you didn't live through the period, you see them if you have any sense of the world. So I felt a great responsibility to be true to that, as did the actors. Brian Cranston and I had considerable conversation about his ties. and which were appropriate and which weren't. And of course, with politicians, there's a fairly limited range of color in politicians' ties. But I also, that's where the LBJ archives in Austin were so helpful, because I had an abundance of photographs, and I could share those, and the archives were open to, they also very kindly let Mr. Cranston go to the archives, so he got to actually see the suits as well. And so it was felt really challenging and critical to be as authentic as I could be.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. I have a question. As someone new to UW here and getting to know the department that your father built and that you were undergrad and grad student in, I loved what you said about the stimulation, the creativity that comes from limitation, and that this whole career of yours was bred out of making something out of nothing, making a silk purse out of a sow's ear, as you said. I'm wondering, as you reflect back being here, what else about your University of Wisconsin experience has shaped your career practices?
Well, I would say that the general, the way in which collaboration was manifested. I told a class earlier this morning that when I was an undergrad here, there was no undergraduate program in costume design. There were sort of general theater classes. And Professor Ezell very kindly said, well, why don't you sit in on my grad classes? And that was huge. The graduate students that were in the class were extremely generous, and that was remarkable too, because here I am, this undergrad, adding on to their class, in their class curriculum. But it was that kind of collaborative spirit was instilled in me at a very early age, and that was really important.
Beautiful. The Department of Theater and Drama is genuinely thrilled to recognize Deborah Dryden, an alum of both the undergraduate and graduate programs in theater and drama at UW-Madison. Professor Dryden is without a doubt the seminal theater practitioner in dyeing and painting and fabric modification in the theater world today. Her book, Fabric, Painting, and Dyeing for the Theater, is still the Bible of fabric dyers, distressers, and embellishers everywhere, though it's been out of print for nearly a decade. She has several distinctions to name, including serving as resident costume designer of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for 39 seasons, and work on most of Shakespeare's plays. Deb received the Irene Sharaff Lifetime Achievement Award, the Michael Merritt Collaboration Award, and USITT's Distinguished Achievement Award. Her design credits include Broadway with the premiere of All the Way. She's worked at over 33 regional theaters and universities and has been a lifelong learner and educator. She taught at the University of California, San Diego for 17 years, where she is Professor Emerita. This is testimony from my colleague, Jim Greco, and her colleague for many years. Deb is a joy to collaborate with on a project. Her knowledge is vast, her sense of humor infectious, her kindness and generosity limitless. Her creativity and dedication to her craft have inspired many, and we're excited to celebrate her outstanding contributions to the world of costume design and theater more broadly. Professor Dryden, thank you for your contributions to the field and to our UW community and beyond, carrying forth the Wisconsin idea. On behalf of the School of Education, we are honored to present you with the Distinguished Alumni Award in Theater and Drama.